welcome to episode 2 of our Security Consultant series. And this is part of our My Security TV's Tech and Sec Weekly, which we've been holding each week and each Tuesday. My name is Richard Kathage. I'm the Executive Editor and Director for My Security Media. And as I mentioned, this particular series is looking at high security buildings, installations, standards, and also today we're going to look at some fire considerations also. The platform that we are using is GoToWebinar. So the audience is still coming in as we start this particular session. But My Security TV, we look at aerospace and space, national security and defence, cyber security and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. In this particular series, a 4-part series, is obviously looking at in that cities and infrastructure, but also critical technology as we talk to some of Australia's most senior security consultants, and I'll introduce them all shortly. The session, we're going to go for at least 60 minutes today, probably a little bit over, see how we go. The sessions are recorded and we can also do a moderated audience Q&A. So if you do have a question on your platform, you have the opportunity to raise your hand or ask a question, and I'll keep a watch out for those and ask them. Also, GoToWebinar, with your attendance, you'll also get a certificate of attendance. And given that we've got some senior ACES people here, and some CPPs, no doubt you'll get some CPE points out of these sessions also. As I mentioned, we have a number of experts from Perth, Melbourne and Sydney, so thank you all of them for their time, and I've already sort of covered off on our format in terms of our focus. This session we're going to run with a 2-part discussion, one on matching requirements to standards to specifications, and then we're going to look at the fire safety balance as well. Thursday night, I'm interviewing Jeff Raby, Australia's former ambassador to China, and his recent book has only just been released, China's Grand Strategy in Australia's Future in the New Global Order. And I think given we're sort of on the back end of the US election, some ongoing issues with Australia and China and trade, that will be an interesting discussion. It's kind of almost like a live interview, live book review at the same time. Some other events, Coronium, they're 17th to 20th November, CISO Online Asia. Check that out on the marketplace as well. And then also next week with the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce on the 18th of November, there in Perth. You are attending events in person there in Perth, so this one is a bit of a hybrid model. So I mentioned the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine is available. I might be able to make that for download next week. There is a number of downloads available off this particular platform, so you're welcome to check that out. But there's about 16 articles with a focus on cloud trends, native, multi and hybrid in that particular edition. And then also there is also link outs to our Indo-Pacific series, which was a 10-part series, and some of our recent podcasts. I mentioned podcasts. We're continuing with our regular feature in terms of our podcasts. Our last 3 episodes, we interviewed the head of the Australian Cyber Security Centre, also looked at the Faking a Factory with an interview there with Trend Micro, and that's a very interesting one where they've set up an OT environment, put it out on the internet, and using it as a honeypot in terms of it being attacked. So if you're into OT security, and we might even touch on some of that with some of these consultants as well. And then also the Info Wars there with Matt Warren, Director of RMIT University. Let's introduce our session for this particular episode. Now, we'd like to thank AMS Australia, who are sponsoring this particular series and their self-latching lock and monitoring box. So thank you very much to AMS Australia. And we do have a number of videos available that we've broken down basic secure door hardware. And that was really the motivation to have a look at this in terms of SCEC requirements. This is a SCEC endorsed product, or going through that process. And we've broken down in terms of both the lock itself, the lever handle, the under door seal, and the like. So at the end of this, and also the blocker plate. So at the end of this session, I'll play one of those videos, but they're also available on our YouTube channel. Thank you to Kevin Foster and Mark Jarrett from episode 1 last week, where we looked at the Handbook 188, and then also Mark took us through the SCEC requirements and that framework as well. So thank you very much, and it's a good segue into this particular episode and apologies from Sarah Trimboli too, who just couldn't make it today, unfortunately, but we will hear from her next week for episode 3. So our panel today, thank you very much for your time, gents. We've got Dr. Kevin Foster there in Perth, and also Dr. David Brooks in Perth, and Richard Kathage is also in Perth. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're not on mute, good on you.
How's it going?
Thank you very much. Very good. Mark in Canberra, thank you very much for joining us once again, and Fraser Holmes in Melbourne.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all.
Thank you.
And can you actually hear me now?
Yeah, look, Mark, you're still a bit grainy, but you come through nice and sort of loud and clear. So.
Okay, because I just found the plug-in microphone and ear set, so hopefully that's a little better than the on-board one.
I do think so. Definitely a little bit better for sure. So this particular episode, we're going to sort of break it down into 2 parts, and we're going to hand over to sort of Kevin to kick it off. And one of the things I wanted to do is, there's sort of 3 parts to this particular question, is how, as a security consultant, do you match standards to specifications, and that all to the operational and functional requirements of the project. And that's also not just the operational requirements, but also the risk profile and the risk sort of mitigation requirements of that. So, and we're really looking for tips and tricks. The audience is quite broad. We've got about 70 registrations for this session, and yeah, everything from manufacturers to other consultants to integrators. So keep that in mind in terms of your audience. But Kevin, balancing standards, specifications and requirements, what are some of your tips and tricks and observations?
Okay, I'll give you a really good tip right up front, which is a sort of high level tip. Thanks, Chris. I mean, for any base building or tenancy design, first and foremost, it is extremely important to always start with the concept design process by referring to Australian standard ISO 31000 risk management and the Building Code of Australia. These 2 are absolutely critical right up front during the concept phase before you get to the detailed design. So this sets the scene. The intent is that the security and fire escape routes in a building or a tenancy are identified, requirements are determined during that concept phase, especially those requirements that might influence the overall architecture and layout of the building on each floor. Really, really important to get in early. And that's also a message for the architects, if there are any that are watching at the moment. If you don't have a security guy on board, you've got to do this. When standards HB 188 Base Building Security Handbook for Building Owners is published, which will be a few months away, then it will become a very important guide as well for exploring the options for the entire security design concept. For example, the positioning of fire evacuation routes, including fire stairs, can have a major impact on the suitability of office areas within the building to be used for high security purposes. As a general rule, the concept design should ensure that it is never necessary for people to escape from a low security area, like a lobby, a lift lobby, through a higher security area to access a fire stair. At your home, you would never take your front door key to the insecure side of your door so that someone could seek refuge in your house if they needed to. At your office in a commercial building, if you have a switch mounted on the wall, such as a break glass on the insecure side of your front door that allows an intruder to simply push it to unlock the electric lock on your door, you've got a serious security problem. That switch would normally only be there if your front entry door is the fire escape door from the insecure side to go through your office and escape through some other door at the back of your premises. This scenario happens far more often than it really should. So it's really important to get your specs right in the concept phase so that that doesn't happen, because there's always another solution. Sometimes this happens because of commercial reasons, like trying to maximise net lettable floor space and that sort of thing, but you just need to be on top of that.
I suppose on that, when you say this happens more often than it should, I suppose that's kind of where the premise of the question is what's driving that? Because obviously that's almost the building function So no one's really giving much thought to the specifications or the standards, because which one should be driving that to avoid it?
Well, I think the disconnect is that the security concept is not being fed into the concept design early enough. So that's why it's important to start working on your specifications and your drawing in the concept phase, not wait for the building design to be completed before the security is considered. So it's a timing issue. So yes, it's a security specification tip, but the timing has got to be right. If you come into the design too late, you miss the opportunity to fix it, because once all the fire escape routes are determined and the building's built, and all you've got is the option of putting locks on doors, it's too late to solve the problem in the best possible way.
I suppose it also comes down to the scope that you're given as a security consultant, because sometimes that might not even be in your scope. Fraser, we had a discussion earlier today around the building types and how the buildings are applied or given a category, and then the security standard is applied to that category. Maybe just talk us through your thoughts around how the building category drives the requirements, which then sets the standard.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Chris. And I guess first up, I'd just like to reiterate what Kevin said. The importance of getting in early is critical to making sure you get your security right. As security consultants, one of the challenges that we constantly face, well, for myself anyway, is if we're engaged through a builder for a base tenancy fit out for a building, rather than an actual tenant moving into that building. So a building owner, a developer or a builder just wants to get the building built, and they want to comply and provide the minimum of what they need to. And generally for that, they'll look at the PCA guide, so the Property Council of Australia, where they have different ratings and levels for buildings. So you'll have a premium grade building, a grade 1 building, and so forth. Realistically, all that means is if you've got a premium grade building, you have X amount of lettable floor space for facilities, for end of trip facilities, for car parking facilities. You'll need a security office, you'll need a concierge desk, you'll need cameras. So it's a very, very generic, broad approach to what's being provided. And from my experience, we often come across that, and it's a challenge because a builder only wants to do the minimum, especially if it's for a base building, and they'll say all we're doing is complying with PCA. However, ideally, if we're engaged by a tenant or an end client moving into that facility who has a specific security requirement, then we're able to look at things in a bit more of a logical manner around what they actually need. So what they need versus what they want can be two different things sometimes, and it's challenging navigating that. But it really comes down to the scope of work that we are providing, as well as what we're actually engaged for. Is it for the base building, or is it for the tenancy fit out? Or if it's for both, in a utopian society, it's a single building with a single tenant in there, and then we're able to incorporate security and design principles into the architecture, into the overall layout and planning and design of the facility to maximize security requirements as well.
David, I'm sorry, yeah, I'm on. Sorry, David, I suppose in terms of the building requirements, and as Fraser just mentioned there, in terms of the type of building, what should be the driver? Because it's either the architect's designing this, when should, rather than when should security come in, how would a security consultant maybe address the gaps between what that standard should be versus what the builders actually, or even the client starts to say, no, we really don't want to go down that path?
I think it's important that we sort of step back a little bit, and my view as professionals, and we're all security professionals here, and cognizant that Richard here is a life safety engineer, is a professional. I think we need to go through sort of a 3-stage process where initially we diagnose. Once we've diagnosed and articulated the problem, we then can go into some sort of inference where we set strategy, and then we go to treatment. Too often we generally jump to treatment. So when we, and Kevin started this, ISO 31000 handbook 167, as a risk, and there's many assessments within the security risk and general risk area, that's the way we can start diagnosing the problem. But sort of come back to the topic of discussion, a part of that diagnosis is guides and standards. Guides and standards are developed by experts using consensus. We come to an agreement, and people don't get onto the standards committee without some sort of expertise. So we can sort of build on that. Once we sort of understand that issue, using risk or guidelines and standards, we can then develop that inference or strategy. That strategy, again, things like a clear specific strategy for our context is absolutely vital. Then that can start developing our concept design, and then we go to detailed design and treatment. So I'm probably not answering your question wholly.
Well, I brought it to you because I knew you would raise risk, and I think risk is the key aspect. Even though you might be caught out to go, look, we're not going to meet a standard here, or that's not going to meet the specification. It always comes back down to that functional requirement and the risk, and you can only sort of communicate the risk back to the client and say, look, there's a gap here. The client will always make that end decision. I'm going to bring it to Mark now as well in terms of the SCEC sort of framework. If there is a gap, I take it you can't give a SCEC tick off. So yeah, where does the sort of difference lie? Maybe in a commercial environment, that that gap may be accepted or acceptable, whereas in a SCEC requirement for a high security building, there's not going to be much leeway. Have I got that right?
Well, hopefully this audio is better. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, it is definitely sound security practice, no matter the nature of the site, to do a proper and thorough security risk assessment before defining any security countermeasures. In the commercial sector, that is often overlooked, and they decide, as David mentioned, what the countermeasures should be without first determining what assets they want to protect and from what. Certainly, from the Australian Government SCEC Security Zone Compliance requirement, it is a mandatory obligation, mandatory and obligatory to first conduct an ISO 31000 compliant security risk assessment before deciding what level of zone you need to go to. That's actually contained in the PSPF, the Protective Security Policy Framework, and the actual specific countermeasures are as prescribed in the ASIO technical notes and related detailed guidance.
Yeah, understood. And I think one thing, we'll come back to you 1 second, Kevin, and also there's a question from the audience is how does this fit into AS 2201, which is the electronic security standard. So keeping that in mind. Richard, I'm not too sure if you're going to touch on that, but go, Kevin.
Just to follow on from that last question and Mark's comment, it's not unusual for Australian government agencies to be tenants in commercial buildings. And so it's my experience in some of the audits that I've done that the problem that I outlined happens in Australian government buildings as well that have to comply with the SCEC and PSPF requirements. And usually the only way you can solve these problems if it's not sorted out in the engineering design is to use other solutions like extra guarding and the like on the premises. And that does happen from time to time. So there are ways to get around it, but they're suboptimal. It's really best to get the engineering right in the first place.
Yep. Although there's not a lot of greenfield sites often, is there? Like to get that beautiful project that, is done perfectly, just really the realistic nature is that doesn't very rarely happens. Go, Mark.
But it should. It should.
Of course. Look, what we'll do, I think we're going to hand over to Richard, and I think Richard, walk us through. You're going to spend about 15 or 20 minutes just walking through the fire and security balance, and obviously we better touch on that. And then for the question in terms of 2201, we'll come back to that because obviously fire alarms and security alarms is another key aspect. Which one goes off first, which is the priority as well, and then what happens when those alarms go off. So thank you to that questioner. Alencio, and we'll come back to you on that. So what we're going to do, we'll hand over to Richard.
Hello and welcome. So today I'll be giving a short presentation just on balancing fire safety and security. This presentation is just based on my experience as a fire safety engineer working on projects which incorporate physical security. In this presentation, I'll give a brief introduction of the National Construction Code, fire safety engineering, insight on how these conflicts occur, some typical examples, and possible considerations in achieving a balance. So modern buildings face many challenges to their survival, which come in the form of hazards and threats, two of such being the hazard presented by fire and security threats. Risks presented by these hazards and threats in buildings are managed through the practices of fire safety and physical security. And differing approaches in the building design potentially result in different impacts on the systems that comprise the building design, potentially leading to a conflict. If fire safety and physical security are not balanced appropriately, we can create a vulnerability and occupants may not be appropriately protected. An important aspect in understanding this balance is understanding the National Construction Code and its application. Furthermore, this is a key text within the world of fire safety engineering within Australia. The National Construction Code, or NCC, is Australia's primary document for design and construction of buildings. It sets the minimum level for safety, health, amenity, accessibility, and sustainability for buildings. It's typically used by architects, builders, building surveyors, hydraulic consultants, and engineers. The NCC is divided into 3 separate volumes. Volume 1 applies to residential and non-habitable buildings and structures. Volume 1 deals with multi-residential, commercial, industrial, and public buildings. Volume 2 applies to residential and non-habitable buildings and structures. And Volume 3 is the plumbing and drainage requirements for all buildings. With respect to fire safety for high security buildings, Volume 1 is the most relevant. There's also a supplementary volume, the Guide to the NCC. This is a non-mandatory text and provides guidance in interpreting and applying Volume 1. Volume 1 and 2 are also referred to as the Building Code of Australia, or BCA, and the Plumbing Code is also known as the PCA. In achieving the minimum level of safety, the NCC has various high-level objectives. This includes safeguarding people from illness or injury due to a fire in a building, safeguarding occupants from illness or injury while evacuating a building during a fire, facilitating the activities of emergency service personnel, avoiding the spread of fire between buildings, and protecting other property from physical damage caused by structural failure. Another consideration with respect to the NCC is its application. So within Australia, the roles, responsibilities and powers of the Australian government are set by the Australian Constitution. Matters which are not mentioned in the Constitution, such as health, safety and amenity of people and buildings, remains the responsibility of states and territories. These responsibilities can also be passed on to local councils. The NCC is empowered by various state, territory and Commonwealth building legislation. So for example, in WA, the WA Building Act and regulation calls for all new building works to comply with the NCC. And although the rules will vary between states, territories and other jurisdictions, in general, building legislation typically requires all new buildings works to comply with the NCC in force at the time of approval, and all new building works must comply and not reduce the safety of the existing building. As mentioned, other Commonwealth jurisdictions have their own specific requirements. For example, building on Crown land may have a different building process. It's important to note that Australian standards are produced by Standards Australia, who are an independent non-profit organisation. And generally complying with the NCC is mandatory through law. However, Australian standards are not mandatory and not legally enforceable by their own rights. The Australian standards are empowered by being directly referenced through legislation, mandatory codes or the NCC. So just in relation to demonstrating compliance with the NCC, historically building codes have been prescriptive with specific design solutions enforced onto building designers through various clauses, such as specifying minimum travel distances to an exit and specifying the number of exits. The NCC is different in that it is a performance-based code. Within the NCC, compliance is demonstrated through complying with the performance requirements. Under the NCC, designers have two options to achieve compliance. The first option is to follow the prescriptive deemed to satisfy clauses, similar to a cookbook. In this instance, designers would comply with the specific clauses set on the NCC. The second option is demonstrating compliance through a performance solution. With respect to fire safety, this is also referred to as a fire engineering solution. Performance solution allows for the adoption of alternative innovative designs and technologies within buildings. Where a performance solution is proposed, it must demonstrate compliance with the performance requirements through the methods outlined in the NCC. Where a performance solution is proposed, fire safety engineers are typically engaged to develop this solution to the satisfaction of the relevant authorities. And typically, most buildings utilise a mixture of performance and DTS solutions. So this comes back to what is fire safety engineering. So there are some definitions worth referring to. The first one being the International Standards Organisation, which notes it's the application of engineering methods based on scientific principles, development or assessment of designs in the built environment through the analysis of specific fire scenarios or through the quantification of risk for a group of fire scenarios. Engineers Australia also notes fire safety engineering is multidisciplinary in nature, having substantial relationships with building services, mechanical, electrical, electronics, chemical, structural and civil engineering, and embraces an understanding of human behaviour. So as fire safety engineers, we come from a range of backgrounds, and typically these backgrounds include mechanical engineers, civil engineers, electrical, chemical engineers, firefighting, and building surveying. As noted, to demonstrate compliance to the NCC, compliance with the performance requirements in the NCC must be demonstrated. Typically within Australia, fire safety engineers are engaged to develop performance solutions. As fire engineers, we utilise scientific principles to evaluate the impact of fire on designs within the built environment. We then develop strategies to mitigate its impact with the ultimate goal of demonstrating compliance with the performance requirements. As part of the strategy, we may also look at specifying various fire systems and other requirements, such as sprinklers, smoke detection, smoke exhaust or stair pressurization. With the exception of fire spread and structural collapse onto neighbouring buildings, the NCC generally does not consider property protection. In addition, requirements relating to physical security, being that for property or life safety, are not considered under the NCC. Typically, these are implemented as separate processes to meet other requirements, such as government policy. Juggling the requirements between multiple standards, requirements, policy, and the NCC can be challenging and potentially lead to conflict. These additional requirements relating to physical security may impact the design, resulting in a non-compliance with the NCC. Typically, as a fire safety engineer, I see this conflict occur on two levels. The first being a direct conflict with the DTS provisions or deemed to satisfy provisions of the NCC and reference standard. For example, as part of the security strategy, you may wish to have the egress doors locked during fire mode. This would result potentially in a direct conflict with the NCC clause D2.21. The second conflict I see relates to a conflict with the fire safety strategy developed by the fire safety engineer as part of the performance solution. So in this example, a smoke exhaust system has been developed for an atrium to extract smoke in the event of a fire. As part of the strategy, it might be desired to have automatic open doors to allow for air to be replenished, and this might compromise the physical security. So some typical examples relates to access and egress, fire brigade access, smoke ventilation, and fire ratings of various elements, in particular door sets. So just relating to access control and egress, so clause D2.21 of the NCC sets out the requirements for operation of latches. Under clause D2.21, all exit doors forming part of the exit and in the path of travel must be readily openable during an emergency. The door can remain locked, provided that it unlocks automatically on fire trip, either through smoke detection, activation or sprinkler activation, or through some other appropriate detection system. There are a number of concessions under clause D2.21. for certain building areas to remain locked, such as vaults, government zones 4 and 5, detention centres. However, there are limitations. In some instances, under clause D2.21, compliance with this clause is not possible, and the doors were required to remain locked as part of the security strategy, even during fire mode. In these situations, the arrangement is typically addressed through a performance solution from a fire engineer, which looks at additional management and use procedures, training, and other fail-safe mechanisms, such as multiple detector activation. Another issue that was brought up previously by Kevin, and is a common one, it relates to egress through neighbouring zones. So in some instances, the fire safety strategy may require alternative egress through neighbouring zones, and this may require very secure doors to unlock. So typically as a fire safety strategy, we might need an alternative exit in the event an exit is blocked, and this may require them to egress through a neighbouring zone. And this can produce problems with the fire safety strategy. Another issue with access control and egress we see relates to heavy sliding doors or automatic heavy doors located in the path of travel. They can be problematic as they are unlikely to comply with the requirements of clause D2.19 of the NCC, which outlines requirements for sliding doors and automatic opening doors. In particular, the doors may not be openable during a malfunction of power failure with a force of less than 110 newtons. As touched on previously, as part of the fire safety engineering strategy for atrium, designs typically incorporate a smoke exhaust system. These systems extract smoke from the top of the atrium with the air replenished through make-up air openings. Typically, these make-up air openings are via front entry doors, and these doors are then typically required to automatically open on a fire alarm, thereby creating an opening for security. This issue can be resolved using mechanical make-up air or make-up air through alternative paths, but it's something that needs to be looked at early on, and it can be quite difficult to fix later on in the design. With fire brigade access, so under the NCC, certain larger buildings require perimeter access. This is to facilitate fire brigade access to all sides of the building and also allow for aerial appliances. Barriers such as bollards can impede this access, which can make it obviously difficult for fire crews to reach certain parts of the building. It's therefore important that these barriers be discussed with the local fire brigade to ensure that their operational requirements are facilitated. In some instances, this can be resolved by providing removable bollards. Once again, it's probably key that this gets discussed early on in the piece, because if it's not, it can be quite problematic to resolve later on. Just with fire performance, so typically secure doors favour heavy steel construction, and all this type of construction will perform well in limiting the spread of fire or flames through the barrier. Due to the conductivity of steel, meeting the insulation requirements will be difficult. It should also be noted that any modifications to the door hardware or fire door need to be verified generally through an assessment or additional testing by a testing authority. So some other issues that should be considered is generally there's little interaction between fire safety and physical security practitioners, and that's just based on my experience. And this can make it challenging to ascertain what is an acceptable risk perception from both sides and how to achieve that balance. Typically also, both fire safety and physical security are typically conducted as separate processes with little sharing of information between the two, which once again can make it challenging to reach a balance or resolving conflict. Furthermore, and this has been touched on previously, is physical security upgrades and implementation may be conducted after building has been completed. And this can potentially have a major impact on the fire safety strategy for the building. So just, I guess from my experience as a fire safety engineer, I believe there's probably a number of things which can be undertaken to assist in resolving conflict and achieving a balance. This has been touched on before, but it's a really important one. Early involvement discussion. It's obvious, but this does definitely assist, as a solution can take time to develop, and also sort of understanding the risks from both sides. So as previously discussed, the NCC's performance base So where non-compliance occurs with the NCC, a performance solution can be developed by a fire safety engineer to facilitate physical security. For example, if the door is required to remain locked during fire mode, a performance solution could be provided to allow for this arrangement. In deciding whether a solution is appropriate and addresses the objectives of both fire safety and physical security, consultation needs to occur with various project stakeholders, all of which will have different perspectives and in some instances, different objectives. And these stakeholders include, but not limited to, obviously security practitioner, the fire safety engineer, so the authority having jurisdiction. So typically this might be a building surveyor, certifier, or building controller. And this stakeholder is important in the sense that they will be ultimately approving the building work. So it's crucial that they're involved in any decision-making process. Another important stakeholder is fire brigade. So fire brigade response will be critical for any solution, and as such, they should be consulted early on. Another one that sometimes gets missed is access consultants. So they sometimes will look at certain solutions relating to heavy doors and be able to provide advice or whether or not it's appropriate for people to be able to open that door. On-site security teams and obviously the client to sort of understand their perception of risk. And that concludes. I guess we'll go into any questions people might have.
Richard. Thank you. Very interesting. I liked your language there on security practitioner versus fire safety engineer. The discussion around security engineering or security engineers has also been sort of one that's been an interesting topic for some time. There is a question from the audience, and thanks, Alencio. Keep coming if you'd like. What's the room here to introduce new technology here, particularly around sort of smoke detection with CCTV, thermal cameras and the like? Is there much room? Is that more of that sort of performance-based approach?
Yeah, so that would be through performance-based. And just, I guess, unfortunately, based on my experience, I typically see it's a bit of a delay with technology adoption. But if someone wanted to use CCTV, which I think could be a great technology to adopt, it would have to be through a performance solution. And that instance, they would have to demonstrate that it's an appropriate technology, it's robust, and it's going to help meet the performance requirements of it's going to meet the performance requirements of the NCC.
Go, Dave.
Just a quick one. I think that there's, as a technology solution, we tend to jump into that very quickly without perhaps having the awareness, and I, Richard, will be very aware of this, of the resilience of the fire life safety systems. They have to be both manual and automated. They have to be pre-programmed. They have to rely on not having a person involved in opening doors, allowing people to egress. So things like cabling, you know, if you put a camera in, we've got to put some pyro cable from that camera, if it's a fire detector, back down to a switch. That switch has to be fire protected to make it a system. Adds all these other issues on. And I think that's why we tend to sort of default into those two separate professions, good or bad.
Richard, maybe just before, and welcome the panel to sort of jump in with your own comments in relation just to fire safety and security balance. But Richard, your research that you're doing with Edith Cowan University, what does that cover?
So that covers the decision-making process in achieving this balance. So how does the decision-making process occur to sort of understand how do we get to this balance between fire safety and physical security?
Kevin, as sort of Engineers Australia, I'm not saying you represent them, but you're obviously a member with Engineers Australia. How do you see the balance between security and fire? I take it fire safety always takes precedence. However, obviously there are examples where security does take precedence in terms of no, we will not be meeting that particular requirement for fire safety.
Sorry, got my microphone down. Yeah, speaking as an engineer and a representative of Engineers Australia and the Risk Engineering Society, it's absolutely imperative to comply with the fire safety requirements in all cases. There is no real debate about that. I think that as security practitioners, we kind of have to accept that there are requirements, but there are always solutions to enable us to create the security we need without actually compromising the fire safety. And sometimes we need to be innovative about that. But I've rarely found a situation where we can't solve these potential conflicts, and we often do. Even in extremely high security areas, I've worked in very high security areas myself. I've never felt like I've been trapped inside a room ever, and we don't need to be. I mean, I don't know much about prisons or how they get people out, but I'd imagine there are a lot of procedures there. But in high security office buildings and the like industrial facilities, it's generally pretty rare to be in a situation where you cannot get out of a room, either through the technology or some sort of training and some sort of procedure that you follow.
Go Fraser.
Thanks, Chris. I was just going to add to what Richard was saying, that communication is just critical between a fire safety engineer and a security practitioner to make sure that you're achieving that balance so that something that is still maintaining its security integrity but allows that egress in the event of an emergency situation. As you alluded to, there are a few instances where there are some challenging items and some challenging areas where it makes it difficult to comply with those fire egress requirements, particularly in a Zone 5 type of area and a prison, where generally in a custodial environment you don't want all the doors opening for obvious reasons. So there's some dispensation that is available and gets provided in those circumstances to make sure that persons in custody aren't able to actually get out of an area. And that also comes back to the coordination and the collaboration between the security practitioner and the fire safety engineer and the architect and the builder. So everyone has to communicate and everyone has to work together to make sure an appropriate solution is maintained. So you can maintain your security, but you can also adhere to the fire safety requirements that you may need to as well. And that's probably one of the areas that does fall down a lot in my experience, that trying to get everyone to communicate rather than everyone going off in their own little areas doing what they know. We all need to come together and work better together collaboratively.
Who's the ultimate decision maker in all of this? Who's responsible for making sure that that communication actually happens at the earliest opportunity? Is it the state regulator, the authority, the sort of the surveying authority, and is that different in different jurisdictions?
Yeah, so it depends on the jurisdiction, and I guess where the project is located. Typically, that will be a building surveyor or certifier, and they will be the ones who will review the solution, and ultimately signing off compliance with the National Construction Code. So typically, most buildings, it'll be the building surveyor or certifier. In some of the other parts, there may be a building controller, which has a similar role. But for most projects, you're looking at the building surveyor or certifier.
And it's the building surveyors that have had a lot of attention, particularly here in New South Wales, over some buildings starting to fall over and sort of fall apart as well. So if they're not getting the basic structural engineering right, I can imagine the complexity between fire and security may also be lacking. And we've seen it in other public buildings as well. I won't sort of go naming names, but I'm sure we've all got half a dozen examples we could all roll off the tongue pretty quickly. I suppose one of the things I wanted to cover off with the high security buildings, and we'll come back to you, Mark, is do you think this is where the SCEC framework does provide a lot more robust protection around that and making sure that the standards are there than, say, normal commercial buildings?
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I also noted with interest Richard's very well made point that the Zone 4 secret, roughly speaking, and Zone 5 top secret are exempt from the freehand single egress requirement because they are deemed to be vaults or strong rooms without public access. And of course, the freehand egress requirement is to prevent entrapment and incineration during fire and emergency situations. The other thing I'd note too is that if you have a AS 1725 compliant fire rated door and you fit the necessary zone 3, 4 and 5 mechanical and electromechanical locking hardware on it, that can well compromise the fire rating. And so you've got a requirement for a fire rated door, but you've also got the ASIO technical notes which say that you must have for a zone 2 38mm solid core block timber, or for zone 3, 4 and 5 45mm solid core block timber. Now, Fraser and I coincidentally had a brief discussion about that earlier today, because there is in fact a door manufacturer which is steel skinned and has been accepted by ASIO T4 as suitable for high security zones, and also can qualify for fire certification. So we were struggling to actually remember the make and manufacture of that door, but we can certainly look that up if it's going to be of use. And the other thing I'd note too is that so really what you're confronted with is for zones 2 and 3, you still need to meet the single freehand egress requirement. And not giving you this seminar series too much of a sponsorship-free kit, but of course the AMS dual lever lock handle solution is it creates a vulnerability because it operates both on the alarm system and the access control simultaneously, and it can have the underdoor release vulnerability if you don't have a good quality Z-shaped door seal and no gaps and all the rest of it. But it is in fact a compliant solution for zones 2 and 3 that can meet a single freehand egress requirement.
And thank you very much for the sponsored plug there, Mark. Unintentional, I'm sure. But it was literally, if you look at the video with that, it was specifically what they were designing that system or that door hardware for. So it was a very clever approach that they took, and being Australian designed and manufactured. So it's well worth highlighting. And it was specifically the problem that they were trying to solve, which I really liked. Fraser, you had an input there?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to add to what Mark was saying. We were discussing that point this morning, and basically you've got a 45mm solid core door with a steel sheet on the front and back, which then complies and meets with the fire requirements. But as Mark quite rightly said, the challenge that we always have, specifically as SCEC consultants, is the challenge between having multiple locks on a door, which provides vulnerabilities from a fire point of view, but they're needed from a security point of view. So it's once again, I guess it is a fantastic topic, I think, to be able to discuss and bring up that balance between fire safety and security, because we quite often, in our experience, get involved in discussions, and unfortunately, they're not always early on in the piece. It's later on in the piece when the doors are going to be installed, and as a SCEC consultant, we come along and go, no, that door doesn't meet the requirements from a security point of view, but it may do from a fire safety point of view. So it's as I said before, it's critical that communication occurs as soon as it can.
Richard, maybe coming back to you, because one of the other comments again from the audience is that fire regulations are legislation, so they're sort of a bit heavier, whereas security is often just a guide or a standard, so it's not sort of legislated against. From your research, is that really dictating the decision-making process? And then I suppose some other comments around how the fire engineer also talks to the air conditioning and air circulation, because that will bring us back around to maybe the handbook 188 in terms of explosives and smoke and chemical sort of distribution as well.
I can't really answer the first one, because maybe in a couple of years, once we've gone through a lot of the phases. But I suspect, yeah, that would be a big driver. Is complying with legislation will be a massive driver. That's my just based on my own personal experience. I think that will be a massive driver. With the one on air conditioning and I guess smoke hazard management through buildings, that's really challenging. And going back to that early involvement's critical. So as a fire safety engineer, when we're designing things like smoke exhaust systems, the biggest challenge is generally make-up air and getting air to replenish it, things like that. And if we have to change that mid through a project, it's very challenging. And that's happened a couple of times when we've got a strategy in place. You know, we want to have the doors open automatically. Then halfway through construction or build, we've been told we can't use that strategy anymore. And that's when it gets very challenging, and we have to look at alternatives. So once again, coming back to that early involvement, it is critical, especially for smoke hazard management and air conditioning in buildings.
Kevin, how's smoke hazard management and sort of the chemical biological distribution threat also managed? Is that covered in the handbook?
Yes, we are. We have mentioned them as threats in the handbook. And just to sort of follow up on what Richard just said, that the great power of the National Construction Code and the Building Code of Australia that's within it is that it is called up in legislation, which makes it extremely powerful. And that's why it's really mandatory. And that whereas in security, I'm not aware of any security standards that are called up in legislation as being an actual requirement. So most Australian standards and ISO standards are not mandatory in Australia because there is no legislation that I'm aware of. There may be some in prisons, I don't know, but generally speaking in buildings, there might be some in hospitals, I'm not really sure, but generally speaking in commercial buildings, there is no legislation that covers security. And so that's kind of why we need a document like HB 188, which in itself probably won't be called up in legislation, but it's got to be a high-level document which is going to deal with a lot of these issues we've been discussing today.
David, did you have any insights? Because I know that there is some healthcare security, I think it is legislated, more around sort of drug storage and those types of things, I would imagine. Yeah, your thoughts on sort of the legislative frameworks and the differences between fire and security in that?
Well, I suppose, Pat, I think Richard summed it up nicely with that getting the early relationship between the practitioners. Again, security professionals tend to suffer with going last as much as fire life safety engineers going last to solve a problem that's been identified through the sort of project management process. So the earlier we can get involved as groups in the concept stage, the better. Specifically to that question, the only sort of controls I know in sort of the hospitals and those sort of medical areas, control of drugs and that aspect, but I'm not that familiar.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be something around the custodial because there's a mix over between mental health and prisons as well. So I'm pretty sure there'll be something there. But you're right, it's limited, and it's limited to vertical. Go, Fraser. Someone's phone's ringing.
Yeah, I was just going to add with that, within the health sector, there's obviously the requirements for pharmaceutical areas, but also for mental health. And generally within mental health, you have three types of areas where you have a walk-in that someone comes in off the street to self-assess themselves, other ones where a patient might be admitted, and then you have your forensic mental health facilities. And the forensic facilities are, for all intents and purposes, a custodial environment. But just quickly on going a little bit sideways, and it could be actually another topic that you may want to consider later on, Chris, and that's, I guess, the vulnerability of these systems. So the vulnerability of your building management systems or your HVAC systems from an external threat. A lot of newer buildings now are looking at using ICNs or integrated control networks throughout the core of a building. And then all of the systems hang off of that. So as security practitioners, we constantly are finding that a base building has been built with an ICN in it, and you have your access control, your CCTV, your intrusion alarm, your HVAC, all of these systems running off of that, which creates a single point of failure, a vulnerability. So also not looking just at the physical security aspects, we need to look at the electronic aspects of the physical security and also the cyber requirements associated with the vulnerability of those systems from an external source as well, and from an internal source.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to touch on, David is with us next week to look at his guidelines on integrated building management systems That's really what we're talking about. And Alencio is enjoying this session as well. And Alencio, we're going to have you on as a panelist at some point. He's only hearing, I'll read this, I only hear silos spoken of, the whole issue of integration over converged networks. And I think you've just nailed it there, Fraser, in terms of this is where we're heading. Both the connected networks are vulnerable, and someone has to be thinking of not only how we are integrating and making them all work, but then what their failure and threat threat landscape is going to look like if they are all interconnected. And there we go, and the single point of failure, because the central network can be made redundant, so you almost limit that that potential failure. So look, on that particular note, I welcome any closing comments on this session. We've been going for just on the hour. Just some closing comments on fire safety. And there was a question if your presentation's available, Richard, but this session was recorded. So if someone wants to sort of review it, they'll be able to review the recording. But just some closing comments, I suppose, and maybe even some tips and tricks, any takeaways that you wanted to offer the audience as we close this session. And maybe anyone want to start us off? Otherwise, I'll kick off with Kevin. Go, Kevin.
No. I've got nothing further to say.
Oh, big button, sorry. Any closing comments? Go, David.
I've just got one go. I know we sort of opened with risk and the importance of risk, but we've also got to have an appreciation that there is guideline standards out there that we can use, so we don't have to solely rely on going through that risk assessment. It's expensive requirement, and standards guidelines really sort of manage a lot of that aspect as well. So I think as professionals, we should rely on those standards and guidelines a lot more to really develop our strategies.
I think the other key aspect that it's applying those standards in a specification, so the specification is read and understood by non-security people as well, that they can understand. There is a sort of a challenge sometimes, and there's some examples there. I think the other one that we might not have touched on very well, and obviously with high security buildings, it's probably less relevant on the external, but also SEPTED, the application of SEPTED is something that is often left until the very end, where everyone's done their work and then they get a SEPTED assessment, and it's like, well, that's just way too late to be changing anything at that point. So, you know, even from that environmental design and sort of non-technical security, just SEPTED basic common sense often gets missed. Kevin?
Yeah, just on the SEPTED issue, I think that's a good point. We do call up SEPTED in HB 188, but it's probably interesting to note that there is work going on right now in the International Standards Organisation to produce an ISO on SEPTED, sort of updated to suit the current environment. And so keep an eye on that one.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed it being in Sydney now versus Perth. The application of SEPTED is quite different. I imagine Victoria is the same. So we definitely need a bit more of a national approach on SEPTED. Yeah, it's a different model over here completely, whereas it's more integrated in Western Australia for sure. So we'll end up having a session on SEPTED. That's a good topic as well. So look, on that note, given interest to time, we're pretty much on the hour. There's no other questions from the audience. For the audience, if you do have any other particular questions that you want to have raised, welcome to email us here at My Security Media, and we'll get that on. Otherwise, you can raise your questions there. So let me just share the final PowerPoint. Yep, just to close off. Look, thank you so much for that. Episode 2 of our 4-series episode. Dr. Kevin Foster, Dr. David Brooks, Mark Jarrett, CPP. Apologies, Sarah, definitely having you on next week. Richard Kathage there in Perth as well, and Fraser Holmes. Thank you so much for your time today, and very interesting discussion. And as I've just closed off, so episode, there's some notes there. So episode 3 next week, we're going to hear from Sarah Trimboli on the application of physical security within government facilities and looking at the FISEC 15 and FISEC 16 policies. These are public documents. I think I mentioned them briefly last week for episode 1. So she's going to walk through those 2 policies. We've touched on it very briefly today, but David Brooks will talk about the Intelligent Building Management Systems Guidance for Protecting Organisations, and that was developed with sponsorship from ACES International. And I'll have in the show notes our podcast, David, we did, I think, last year on that particular session as well. And we'll be joined by Rachel DeLuca on the challenges to maintaining security design integrity after builder novation. And again, we've touched on that, but she's going to dive into more detail on that episode next week. So that's next Tuesday, 17th of November at 1 o'clock. And then the following week, 24th, we'll close off with another panel session and looking at more the smart connected buildings, precincts and cities and achieving that safety and security balance. So again, we'll have you all back. As we've mentioned, this session is sponsored by AMS Australia. So thank you, AMS. And your self-latching lock monitoring box, the 333 as they call it, and the sort of the door hardware and security suite of products there. They'll be very happy for a bit of a plug during this episode. What I'm going to do to close off, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to play, I think I will play the blocker plate video. And after that, we'll close off. These sessions are available on My Security TV and our YouTube channel. I'll probably have it up later, either later today or tomorrow morning, and it'll be in our newsletter in tomorrow with the link and otherwise on the social. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to close off with playing our AMS video so our panelists can stay on the line. But I will close off the session following. So here we go with our blocker plate video. Thank you for joining us. In this particular session, we're going to talk about the AMS Australia blocker plate. These are potentially vulnerable areas of the door here, and this is a specially designed stainless steel blocker plate. So talk us through it, Trevor.
There's a number of blocker plates on the market, and I'm sure people are aware of them, but they have a few shortcomings. And one of the main shortcomings with other blocker plates is that they have what they call a peel effect. You can actually literally peel them off the door, because what they generally tend to rely on is studs that go through the door, and whether it's a surface mounted stud or whether it's an actual invisible or a rear fixed stud, they all work on the same principle, i.e. studs through the door. But one of the problems is with them, as I said, is that you can actually peel them off. So what I decided to do was to design a blocker plate that will take both locks simultaneously, as we've already discussed, because that's what the security requirements require. But what it's done as well is we have studs that are actually TIG welded onto the inside of this blocker plate that actually locate with these screws here on the inside. But also, to get over that peeling effect, what we've actually done is we actually TIG welded on stainless steel tabs. So you have 3 screws going through the door with welded studs, and you have 6 screws going into the edge of the door. And what this actually does, it actually stops the peel effect. So you can't get to the edge of the door. You couldn't, if that door was closed, get a jemmy bar in there and try and rip it open, because you're getting two-way fixings through the door and into the edge of the door, which actually gives it high security as far as that goes.
Nor are you getting into the locking device.
Exactly. So this is designed in such a way that the distance here will actually completely cover the 333 and also the electric strike within one. Yep. So when that's actually closed, you can't get anything down there to actually attack any of the mic switch boxes and or the locks themselves. And also, of course, one of the other things is this is made out of one piece of stainless steel. So whenever you bend stainless steel, you increase its strength dramatically. And also, once it's bent and then TIG welded in, stainless steel, that is extremely solid. You won't bend that off the door. You will not actually rip that off. It just won't happen. The door will give way before that will.
Right.
So from that point of view, it's a very, very secure product, and it covers up all of the hardware. So, and of course, it's designed to work in conjunction with the two locks. So the tabs actually don't clash with any of the faceplates of the locks either. And obviously, you've got maximum screw points.